Hey everybody, it's me, just giving you another video today. This time it's going to be a wrestling video, and this is going to be the video some of you've been waiting for, another wrestling forgotten gems. This time it's going to be number 2. This is going to be, like I said, a series where I talk about classic wrestling moments that most people really don't talk about, or classic matches, classic feuds, titles most people tend to remember but then tend to forget, feuds, like I said, tag teams, and just everything else that most people tend to forget because they look at the main stuff that was happening in WCW, ECW, or the WWE or WWF at the time. So I'll get to that and I'll explain it and I'll explain why it shouldn't be forgotten and why things were so good or things why were so bad. But let's get to this video. So enough of me talking about that. Let's get to this video. This is gonna be this is a Wrestling Gems number 2 video. This time I talk about the last video. I talked about the last Wrestling Gems video number 1. I talked about the Raven and Chris Benoit feud, which was probably one of the most underrated feuds in WCW, even though it was a short feud, and it was only to give Raven something to do before he feuded with DDP. This time I talk about the Dean Malenko Chris Jericho feud, which many people tend to forget, that, and many people tend to not realize that this feud was the thing that elevated the Chris Jericho to the most hated heel, and it elevated Chris Jericho's heel status to like one of the most hated heels in the WCW. Even though you had the NWO still, the NWO Black and White, and then you had Raven's Flock, but this is the feud that pretty much had Chris Jericho. It solidified Chris Jericho as almost a star in the making and one of the most hated heels in WCW. So let's get started. We go all the way back to January. This whole thing started all the way back in January, where Chris Jericho beat Rey Mysterio Jr. at NWO WCW NWO Sold Out '98, and Chris Jericho was parading. Well, Rey Mysterio took a break because he had problems with his knee. Then Chris Jericho was parading around with Rey Mysterio's mask and saying that now he's going to be a trophy collector and collecting all of his opponents' more precious merchandise. So he had Rey Mysterio's mask. So he would wear that to the ring, or he would have that on top of his shirt, and he would just come to it. Then one man who took offense, well, no, I think it was it was either Rey Mysterio's mask. He took it, and then another wrestler who took offense to it was Juventud Guerrero. Juventud ended up having a match with Chris Jericho, and the stipulation was that if Juventud was to win, then he would win the WCW Cruiserweight title, and he wouldn't have to unmask. But if Juventud lost, then he would have to unmask, and, well, of course he would lose, and then he would have to unmask and wrestle with no mask. So the match happened at Super Brawl 1998. Chris Jericho beat him, and Juventud Guerrero went on to lose the match and have to unmask. So Chris Jericho went on along carrying the trophies of Rey Mysterio and Juventud Guerrero, and then he set his sights on one man, that was Dean Malenko. So the two had a match at Uncensored 1998, and of course many people thought that Dean Malenko was going to be the one to take the belt from Chris Jericho. Well, that wasn't the case, as Chris Jericho ended up beating Dean Malenko, and then after the match, Dean Malenko cut a really sad promo about him leaving WCW and taking a break for a while, and saying that he doesn't have, well, Mean Gene said he didn't have the heart. Dean Malenko said like one or two words, and he just walked out of the ring, and you wouldn't see or hear from Dean Malenko for quite a while. So the next couple of Nitros, Chris Jericho would insult Dean Malenko. He would say Dean Malenko didn't have charisma. He would say all the moves. Chris Jericho has more moves than Dean Malenko in his wrestling book, and then he would just continue to insult Dean Malenko and then talk about his father, and and everything about Dean Malenko, and saying that his father was a quitter as well, and then saying that Dean Malenko was a joke, and just the whole 9 yards, just saying basically everything he could say to get Dean Malenko to come back. So we head on to Slamboree 1998 because WCW, the commissioner, who was J.J. Dillon at the time, he ordered Chris Jericho to compete in a Cruiserweight Invitational matchup. Well, to face the winner of the Cruiserweight Invitational matchup, where it was a Cruiserweight Battle Royal, I believe, to determine who was going to wrestle Chris Jericho at Slamboree 1998. So after the cruiserweights, we got down to the last two. It was Juventud and Ciclofe, and they were doing their moves, and then all of a sudden, Juventud for some reason eliminated himself, and many people were just scratching their head like, why would Juventud do that? And then after that, after Juventud left and Ciclofe won, he went on the mask, and it was Dean Malenko, and oh man, the place went ballistic. This place just the roof just went off when Dean Malenko unmasked. And then of course you had the match. Dean Malenko beat the hell out of Chris Jericho. He was stomping him, he was punching him, he was doing basically everything. He was just putting months of frustration Chris Jericho put him through, and he was taking it out on Chris Jericho. And then the end came when Dean Malenko he went up from the top, and he put the move with his knee onto Chris Jericho's gut, put him in the Texas Cloverleaf, and Chris Jericho tapped out. And that was probably one of the most emotional moments I ever seen in a wrestling matchup. But that wasn't the end, as the two would feud even more, which will lead to a match between the two where if Dean Malenko was to win, then of course he retained his belt and he would never fight Chris Jericho. If Chris Jericho was to win, then Chris Jericho would be the Cruiserweight champion, and the two would never wrestle again, or it would have to be the DQ or whatever. Of course, Dean Malenko got DQ'd after disobeying what the referee was saying, and then of course the two wouldn't wrestle again. Then we head on to, I believe it was Hog Wild 1998, I believe, or Road Wild 1998. Juventud Guerrero would fight Chris Jericho for the Cruiserweight title. Juventud would beat him, with Dean Malenko as a special referee. Dean Malenko screwed Chris Jericho over. And then, of course, Chris Jericho got all mad and threw hissy fits of him being screwed by WCW for putting Dean Malenko in there. And then, of course, I believe, he wrestled Rey Mysterio, of course, and Rey Mysterio beat him. I believe it was weird how that happened, but overall, and that was the feud right there, as Chris Jericho and Dean Malenko wouldn't wrestle, but the heat on Chris Jericho after tormenting Dean Malenko and this feud with Dean Malenko, he had so much heat in this feud, and it just elevated him in even more heel status, and it elevated his stock as more people would start paying more attention to Chris Jericho and WCW. And this was just a feud that Chris Jericho needed to put himself up there with the elite. Of course, WCW ended up they did push him more, but of course they had the feud with him and Chris Jericho, a mini feud, and WCW somehow fucked that feud up. But overall, this was probably one of Chris Jericho's best feuds in the part of '98. He would feud with Saturn, but that wasn't really a good feud in my opinion. The feud Chris Jericho had with Dean Malenko was probably one of the best feuds that was happening around that time in the middle part of 1998. It was just a awesome feud, and it was just good to see two good wrestlers feuding with each other over some sort of a cause, and that's what made this feud even more better. It's a shame what happened to Dean Malenko. Right after he feuded with Chris Jericho, he would go right down to mid-card and be treated like some sort of a joke, even though he did reunite with Horseman, but he wasn't really doing anything after the Chris Jericho feud. But still, this was probably one of the best feuds going on in WCW in the mid part of '98, even though you had the Wolfpack NWO Black and White. Anyhow, I'm out. Rate